Australia's climate change advisor Ross Garnaut has released his final report today, calling for a shake-up of income tax to compensate low to middle-income households for the imposition of a carbon tax. Green Senator Milne spoke to ABC News 24's political editor Lyndal Curtis a short time ago. She says the Greens support most of the recommendations made by Professor Garnaut, but disagree with the suggestion to halve assistance to pensioners.
Milne, welcome to News 24.
Thank you.
Ross Garnaut has delivered his final report on the question of carbon pricing, detailing what he thinks should happen, particularly with household compensation and business compensation. You've had a lot of time for Ross Garnaut's recommendations. The question of a fixed carbon price, then a floating scheme, was originally one of his that you picked up. What do you think of the shape of his final report?
Well, I think there's a lot of things in it that we agree with. It's a very important component of our consideration, and it was the committee that asked him to go and update his report. Most of it, though, is unchanged from the chapters that he'd already released over the last 6 months, so there'll be no big surprises. But certainly on issues like household compensation, there's agreement right around the table that that should be more than 50%. The Greens have been arguing for a long time for money into innovation, commercialising new technologies so that we get them there in time to make the transition out of coal and so on. So there's a lot in there that we would agree with and that we've certainly campaigned for, including the fact that there is no rationale for large compensation to coal-fired generators.
One area where his recommendation does differ is change from the carbon pollution reduction scheme is that the compensation for business falls over time under his suggestions. Would you agree with that? But would that, if it comes into being, make it more difficult for the government to argue to business it should support the scheme?
Certainly we've argued that the energy-intensive trade-exposed assistance should decrease over time, but we have supported the Professor Garnaut's principled approach, which is to say let an independent body like the Productivity Commission go and do the work and actually establish the truth about the levels of trade exposure and then adjust the assistance accordingly. So I think business can take heart from the fact that what the Greens want to see is an evidence-based approach and a transparent approach. So if they are as genuinely trade exposed as they say they are, then they'll be compensated.
And would that be your attitude going through the early years of this program, that assistance would not necessarily be withdrawn if the trade exposure continues, if other countries don't move as fast as you would like?
Well, that's where the principled approach comes in, and we would certainly like that to come into play as soon as it can. We recognise that would be a few years down the track. As Gary Banks has said, he can't do the work in the time frame. So whilst we have just received the Productivity Commission report, and it hasn't come to the committee as yet, the government has it, I don't expect that to be able to inform us as much as we'd like. So we're going to have to go with an interim approach, but I'm very keen to see that we move to an evidence-based one as soon as possible.
The Prime Minister told Question Time that tax cuts are a serious option. Tax cuts were recommended by Professor Garnaut, particularly an increase to the tax-free threshold. Is that both a politically convenient way to distribute the compensation and a better way to distribute the compensation, because you're not doing it like for like? You're not saying electricity prices goes up, here's some compensation for that. But it's also politically harder to argue that those tax cuts should go.
Well, certainly that's one of Professor Garnaut's options that no doubt the government finds very attractive. We are considering all those options in the committee, but one thing that I'm concerned to see is that we do adequately compensate the low-income earners, but especially those who might be on pensions or other government benefits, and that's where the Greens would disagree with Professor Garnaut, because he was suggesting halving the level of assistance to pensioners, for example, and we don't think that would be appropriate, because certainly we're aware that many people on benefits really will be taking on a number of the costs passed on to them by the large polluters, and we want to make sure that they're fully compensated.
Because as Professor Garnaut points out, and a point the opposition has picked up, households will end up bearing the full cost of the carbon price.
Well, the extent to which those polluters pass it on, and they will be trying to pass on as much as they possibly can. That's why we want to make sure that households are assisted, unlike Tony Abbott, who is going to take that money out of taxpayers' pockets to actually pay the polluters. While he's running around saying the polluters will pass on the costs, we're saying yes, that's the case, and that's why we are going to help people meet those costs. His scheme just simply says, I will take it out of the taxpayers' pockets and cut services in order to pay the polluters. I don't think that is actually what the community wants.
Is it a fair assessment from businesses' point of view to say that the best scheme that business could have had was the last iteration of the CPRS, and that whatever you come out with will not give them as good a deal?
Well, it depends if you're talking about the vested interest or the national interest. I think from the point of view of the vested interest, yes, they couldn't have had a better deal than they got under the carbon pollution reduction scheme, because by the time the Rudd government had given them generous assistance and then the coalition got in there and gave them even more, it had got to the point where they were wildly overcompensated, and it was one of our main criticisms of the scheme. This time we want to make sure that compensation especially, is as evidence-based as we can make it, and that it is an economically rational scheme, that it doesn't have all these carve-outs for political interests. And that was a strong point that Professor Garnaut made today, that what we are now seeing is a slip backwards into the old political culture of rewarding vested interests, which has resulted in lower productivity for the nation.
But what will you do if the independent commissions say that business actually needs more compensation than you suggest when you put the final details together?
Well, we'll have a look. Once we get, there's a couple of ways of looking at the independence. Professor Garnaut recommended 2 or 3 new bodies. One was a commission to recommend on targets. Another was to look at the level of trade exposure. If we get the principled approach and the evidence base, then of course we will be taking notice of what that evidence base is. But what we're seeing at the moment is a mixing up of the costs associated with the high dollar, and of course that's input costs as well, and also looking at trade exposure. We are mixing up a number of things.
Christine Milne, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
And now to sport with